Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Guillaume Couche, Design Director of Oh Hi Tomorrow, an agency based in London, about his and co-founder and co-director of Oh Hi Tomorrow, Richard Shackleton's recent book, Interface Design, Creating Interactions that Drive Successful Product Adoption, published by BIS Publishers in May this year.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Guillaume Couche, interaction designer and now published author of Interface Design, Creating Interactions that Drive Successful Product Adoption, which you published with BIS or BIS quite recently. And that will be the subject of our discussion today. But Guillaume, mispronounced terribly, I'm sorry. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ambrose. I think the pronunciation is pretty good by this country standard. By the way, it's the equivalent of William, which keeps surprising people when I say it, whereas I think it sounds fairly similar, but it is written quite differently. So thank you for having me. So a bit of background on how we came to write this book. So I moved to the UK in 2012 to study at the RCA, the Royal College of Art in London. I think at the time I really thought I would stick to physical products, so traditional product or industrial design. I knew nothing about software. I knew nothing about electronics. I would say even less electronics than software, which historically sounds weird, but I think the reality is we've all, at least my generation, we grew up using software. And we used electronics as well, but I think the barrier to entry to electronics was always a bit more scary than, doing a bit of code. Maybe, if you use Excel and spreadsheets, you might do a bit of Visual Basic or something that looks a bit like coding. Whereas, assembling transistors and stuff was really not my thing. But at that time, I think it was not completely new, but there was a lot of this like Arduino stuff. So if you would study design like 15 years ago, you would start to be able to incorporate in physical product this kind of like, interactive bits. So, you add an Arduino and suddenly you can say, well, if someone sits on my chair, a light switches on or something like this, Doesn't need to be very complex, but I think when we started realizing that, I say we because I think we were all in the same journey as students. I don't think that was very unique about myself. In fact, all the projects you would see at the time at the RCA, and I think maybe even to this day, but at the time definitely everything was like physical, digital. It was always this association of these two things. So in the end, I thought I would do a lot of physical things, and we ended up doing a lot of like mixed of, interaction design and industrial design. And just as we were graduating from the RCA with some friends from the college, we co-founded two startups. One of them being a 3D design tool, so a tool for creatives using what at the time was, quite new, virtual reality. So we were thinking, okay, at some point, everybody is going to have glasses instead of just a laptop, right? At that time, you couldn't really do things with augmented reality, but virtual reality was definitely, starting to be affordable and easy to use for designers. So we started to build a tool that could, change the way we were designing things. And I think that made me realize, at least, that something was changing. I think interaction design was not a new discipline at the time, but bringing this kind of like digital gate in the physical world you could see it was going to allow to really change the way we think about interactions and how we relate, how the physical and the digital world interact with each other. So when I left and co-founded a design studio, we heavily, I think, invested, in time. We didn't have any money, but we heavily invested our time in like trying to be, interaction design first, but really focused on like these kind of new technologies, which is always a bit of a weird thing because you want to keep design kind of technology agnostic. You don't want to start and say, oh, whatever problem we're going to be looking at, the solution is going to be, using virtual reality or something like this. But there is also a market imperative that, if you portray yourself as a design studio that's very good at this one technology, it's much easier to attract clients. So you're kind of like balancing these two things. And yeah, I think, very opportunistic at the beginning, just trying to do, what we could and getting the clients that would, be interested in working with us. Over years, we started to really manage to turn the studio to what, we really wanted to do, which is, solving maybe real world problems. And I think the first time we really did that at a big scale was when we started working with Queen Mary University, which is also in London, and NGOs in Cape Verde, where we would, we help them invent and design tools for tracking turtles. So it's really like where you can see how what you've learned at school, new ways of, thinking about things and design, invent new product can help solve real problems. In that case, it's wildlife protection, change of policies, etc. So that's been like the first, I would say, big evolution in the studio journey. And of course, in parallel, all these years, we were also running our own project. I say, of course, because I think it's quite a common practice for design studio to kind of fund passion projects on the side of like client work. And that, I think the combination of all these things we were doing led us to finally land projects with, the kind of clients that design studio want to work for, like big clients who work on like, things that will change the world. But the problem we met when we started doing that is suddenly you realize you cannot speak about any of your work. So it's really nice, it's very exciting, but nobody will ever know about what you did. Which personally I'm fine with. I think I'm very happy not to have to explain my mom what I do anymore. And I'm very happy not to speak about work with my friends at the weekend, but certainly from a business perspective, it brings new challenges. The usual paradigm of a design studio shows what they've been doing in the past to make people understand what they could be doing for them in the future. We could still do that, but what people would see was increasingly different from what we were doing. So even today, if you look at Wolf in Motion Studio, which is the studio we had just before Oh Hi Tomorrow, you will see, that we do stuff with turtles. You will see all this kind of in-house projects, but you won't see all the secret stuff we've done. So that led us to start a new studio, which is very young. I think we started 3 months ago.
Oh Hi Tomorrow.
Yeah, Oh Hi Tomorrow, where we really try. At the moment, it's like the website is a draft, I would say. But we are really trying to embrace this new paradigm of, okay, we cannot show what we do. So let's try to explain what we can do for new clients without showing past work. And the book, even if it was not motivated by that, because we started writing it almost 2 years ago, definitely plays in that new kind of communication strategy where, in a way, it's probably better if you want to know who we are to read what we wrote than just looking at projects we've done in the past. So I think it's probably it's a bit harder for people because it's not something, you would need to buy the book or, there are a few extracts we have online, but that's the new orientation of the studio.
And this is you and Richard Shackleton. You're the founders of Oh Hi Tomorrow. Have you been working together for
Yes.
a long time? Is this
Yeah.
who you started with previously?
Yes. So Richard comes from strategy. So he's worked in product, then moved to strategy and done like proper corporate strategy. So there is something we might speak about today, maybe not, but in the design world, much less in architecture, but there is a proliferation of the term strategy everywhere, which is very confusing because it tends to mean many things, but usually not strategy, which, in the corporate world is understood as, running companies and making big decisions. Whereas when people associate design and strategy, and I'm probably going to make enemies when I say that, but I think often they just mean doing their job as designers and doing it well, which is very confusing because there is definitely massive benefits of combining, traditional design skills with traditional strategy skills, because you can look at, the future strategy of a company by looking at the products that they are going to be making. So Richard really comes from that world of helping CEOs drive their company and understanding, where they're going.
So is strategy sort of like the infrastructure or the architecture that sits behind the product? How do we define the design activity? I suppose would be a better way of putting it. How do you differentiate the two? Because the way I see design is I suppose I fall into the category that you just denounced so soundly, which is that design is future orientated, it's projective, it's imaginative and speculative, and I guess assumed that maps very closely with strategic thinking.
You're absolutely right. And I think for me, that's where it's a bit of a shame that it's been so overused, the term strategy, because there is etymological connection. Design is the intention, is the projection, as you said, which is also strategy, right? So there is definitely an alignment. Now, in terms of practices, corporate strategy in a company, it's really, data informed, looking at markets, trying to project big decisions that might have nothing to do with product. It could be, acquiring a company, selling part of a company. So part of strategy can rely on product, but some part of, and a big part, I think, of corporate strategy doesn't necessarily have to do with product vision. And here I use vision because I think a lot of what design can do for strategy is to do with vision. So, a lot of what we do with our clients is we use design to help them establish a vision. So a strategic vision of their product line, for instance. What are they going to be making in 10 years? And that in turn informs their strategy. But you can also, and that's, I think, what I was denouncing. I don't know if denouncing sounds a bit like strong of a word, because I'm sure I do that as well. It's just easy to play with words constantly, right?
Yeah.
What I find, and you see that a lot with the younger generation, people, I think, associate strategy with something that is, very grand. It sounds good, right? Do you want to be the guy making the decisions, or do you want, to be, operating under the supervision of the person who's doing the strategy? So, and because it's a bit open source as a term, strategy is not like a profession where there is, a stamp that you need to. There are some. I'm sure there are, like, if you do an MBA, you can probably have a strategy kind of elective and have that on a diploma. But I believe a lot of people who do strategy come from very unique pathways where they little by little, emerge to operate in that field. So it's very loose how you can define someone as being a strategist. And I think the result of that is it became a trend. First so strategy comes from military, then it went to business in general, then went to marketing, advertising, so strategic planning. And I think, strategy, marketing, advertising, then it went into design. As something that helps upsell, I think, the kind of services that you might be selling in the first place. But I don't think it changed the way design was done. That's why I say people tend to use it just to say that they do their job properly. But if you ask people when they say they are a strategic designer, what they mean exactly, very rarely you will hear someone who actually has something to do with big corporate decisions about the future of a company.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a bit long on strategy, but
No, no, not at all.
yeah, yeah,
It's really interesting. It is a very fascinating thing because I mean, so obviously I'm coming from this from the perspective of architectural design, which is at a bigger scale, and perhaps hopefully we can get on to talking about perhaps the overlaps between your practice and design practice, and the world that you work in and its
yeah.
potential in the world of the built environment in the making of massive objects or buildings. But I
And
just wanted to come. I just go on. Sorry.
no, I just wanted to finish because you were asking me about Richard, so
Yeah.
just going to finish on that. Richard comes from proper strategy.
Okay.
Like he's helped, drive companies. And we met him because he was going to invest in one of the startups I co-founded after the RCA. And then we remained friends. So he was doing investment on the side of his job. We met this way, and then we remained friends for many years. And I was all the time saying, when do you join me as a director? Because I could see that having a real strategist in a world of design where everybody pretends to be a strategist would be so good. Also, he's a really good designer. And we were discussing just before about people who come to design without being formally trained as designers.
Hmm.
And he's one of these people, he's, I think, excellent. He
Hmm.
has all the skills that you would expect from a designer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that happened a few years back where he joined as a director of Wolf in Motion. And so we started naturally the new studio together.
Brilliant. So you've mentioned obviously the book. It's sort of like a calling card for clients, but the way it's presented, on one level, it's a calling card for clients. I'm not trying to
Yeah, yeah.
diminish it. It's a very interesting way of presenting a book around a kind of complex topic. Because when I was telling people I was going to do this podcast with you and showed them your book, and it sort of jumps out at people that it's, I guess, something that people don't even recognize as a thing to a certain extent, and perhaps we can get into some of the aspects of what it actually is. But why did you decide to write this book? Was it a, COVID lockdown project, or was it because there's a deficit of understanding in the general population and in designers particularly about the significance of this thing that you do?
Okay, very interesting question. And I think there are a few questions within. So first, yeah, definitely it's not a thing. And in a way, the fact that we could get as a title interface design, which by the way was not the project title for the book, but then the editor was like, guys, nobody ever called the book interface design. It seems to be the topic of your book. And we had this super cool name, which was on, off, and everything in between. And he was like, yeah, that's great. I'm sure some of your friends in London will get the title, but if Amazon doesn't understand the title of your book, they won't,
Yeah.
stock it. So you need something clear. So anyway, the fact that the very name interface design had never been used for a book, I
Hmm.
think says a lot about the fact that it's not a thing and it's
Hmm.
not recognized as a thing. Um, so yeah, it didn't. So it really didn't come as a business card thing. And I know that it kind of like looks like this when designers, who are practitioners write a book. People assume that they're going to be speaking about their studio and trying to sell something, which we very deliberately try not to do in this book. So I think we never speak about us or project we've done. It's really like, we look at big examples of design that are, things that everybody will know. But the idea came, I think, I think it was two inspirations. One, we had recurring discussions with clients where, someone wants to launch a new device and they ask us what we think the interface should be. And I felt a bit, that's weird. There is no resource like where, I have opinions. I can make a little presentation for tomorrow to list all the interfaces that we could use, but I don't have resources to do that. Like I couldn't find a book to do that. But then I realized these clients, some of them are really famous for making really cool interfaces. So why do they ask me? And then I realized every time we had discussions about interfaces, we would speak about the technical components of the interface. it very quickly becomes an engineering discussion. So I don't know if there would be a good analogy, but it's as if, to discuss architecture, you had to go in the details of construction methodologies, right? So instead of being able to have this abstract layer of like the societal or historical or cultural, layers of what architecture can be, straight away you're discussing like the kind of tools you're going to be using. That was kind of where we were with interface, and I think we still are there. I don't think our book has changed the world, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Maybe it will, I hope. So yeah, we just found it a super interesting challenge, and we had Sam who was working with us. And before it was a book, I was telling Sam, can you do some research on that? Can we have a map? So one of the chapter, I think it's the first chapter or the second chapter, is kind of a list of all the inputs. And so Sam was working on trying to map that. But before we knew it was this list, right? So trying to make because you can very easily fall into the trap of looking at it from a technical angle, and then you have 150 different inputs, right? But then a button is a button, right? A knob is a knob. So then we tried to make rules. And I think once we cracked that, when we realized, okay, these are like the 14 inputs. Every interface you can look at falls into one of these 14 things. Then we started to realize, it would be good to speak as well about behaviors, I take a button on my bicycle light, and if I click once, it's light. If I click twice, it's blinking. 3 times, it shuts off. So, you add a software behavior to one button to create new kind of interaction with one input. And I think the more we were discussing, the more we were like, okay, it's not a poster. It's more like a book. There is something to say. And then we realized there was all these like questions about the future, like, how it was going to evolve. And yeah, that's when we started to reach out to publishers, and BIS was interested. And we realized, okay, let's do it, we can try to write this book. So it was a very, I don't know, we are used to, starting things from scratch it's what we do as a job, right? So a book was just a new type of thing that we could do. So we just approached it like any design project. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does, but it's begging the question, isn't it? Which is, what is interaction design? I mean, what are we? So you've got it's beginning of chapter 2. You've got these 14 points, different types of interaction with machines, with technology. But I think, again, just to step back, I think there would be some level of a surprise, perhaps, in everyday life that this component, say, for example, the button on your phone or the not button on your phone, is a specific design task within the task of producing a product. So how would you it's a complicated, again, because it's a complicated question about the interaction between process, behavior, technology, and an object. But like, how do you set about, I suppose, the process of considering how to design an interaction?
Yeah, so I think I understand your question. I might not, but I will say something and we'll see. We didn't call the book Interaction Design, and we don't really say it's about interaction design.
Okay.
Although obviously there is a link between interface and interaction.
Okay.
And the reason for that, and it's also part of an answer to your previous question that I didn't give, is when we really started to research, shall we write a book or not? Once the idea of the book was, kind of in our mind, we did a bit more research, and we realized there were many books about interaction design. I mean, not many, but some very good ones, including a book called Designing Interactions by Bill Mogridge. I hope I pronounced the name right. But they tend to be use case or case studies books. So, they will look at like existing devices and how the interactions are great interactions or have failed to deliver something. So there was not something theoretical that was at the object level. The other category of books that we could find a lot of were more like, digital interactions. So everything that usually is UI, UX, user interface, user experience. So our book is not called Interaction Design, and it's not specifically about designing interactions, where there is already a lot of theories and a lot of things. I think it's a bit subjective, but my interpretation is like when interaction design was born, there was a desire to like remove it from technology. Because I think before that, when so if we do a very quick history of interaction design, and again, that's my take on it, it's very subjective. I think, and that's what I tell students in general. I forgot in the intro we teach, by the way, in some universities.
Which ones?
Well, Royal College of Art in London and Lund University in Sweden,
Uh-huh.
and Imperial College as well in London. So usually my short history of interaction design, the way I like to frame it is, I think until you have complex interactions. So let's say if you have a lamp, so Dieter Rams did a lot of objects that had there were some sort of machines already, right? You have radios, alarm clocks. But I think on these objects, rather than interactions, it's like action reaction. So you press something, something happens, right? You can, I don't think you need as a designer to conceptualize too much the behavior of the object. It's very easy to kind of like keep it in the back of your mind while you design the object. It doesn't drive the design of the object. I think from the moment where you bring some sort of intelligence, so let's say the computer, you start to have this thing where, one set of keys, so the keyboard, can lead to a billion of possible things. Because depending on the application that you're running, you might be typing text, you might be playing a video game, you might be doing Photoshop. So I think at this moment, you cannot just map or chart actions and reaction. It's just, you need a different model. It's not like I do that, this thing happens, right? You need to start to think about all the possibilities of objects as behaviors. And I think that's the moment where interaction design was born. And of course, it was not theorized from the beginning. So that stayed, I think for many years, interaction design was effectively done by, the people who were building the machines. So engineers, scientists, tinkerers. And I think in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000, you start to really have a field called interaction design, which, is taught in design schools, done by designers who are not looking at interactions from a technical perspective, who really bring this kind of design way of doing things, but for intelligent objects and machines. So now I forgot a bit the question about.
Well, I mean, no. I sort of take your point about the lack of clarity in my question. I suppose what I'm asking, and from what you've just been saying as well, is that this form of design, interface design, seems to have its basis in, I guess, a sort of psychology or sociology of user
Mhm.
as its starting point. Like you were saying, the pressing of a light button. It has to feel, and they always do, a little rubbery switch, and it feels like you're pressing something on. And so you're kind of conscious of the action even when you're not considering it. Which is differentiated, I suppose, from a kind of more ordinary interaction with a basic object, like the picking up of a hammer or the cutting with a knife, for example. So I'm kind of interested in how you as a designer begin this process of, I guess, writing the brief or problematizing the condition that you've been given so that you can start projecting a design solution.
Um, yeah, so how specifically interface design maybe differs from industrial design, making an object without considering the
Mhm.
interface, or
Mhm.
interaction design being more abstracted in what the machine might be doing while looking at how it could be doing that. Um, I think, okay, w one of the inspiration of the book, or one of the reason we felt it was important is you were just describing here different modalities of interaction, which are driven by the interface. Um, and sometimes I have discussions like, I don't know, my dad will be asking me why a new amplifier for music, is like this infinite kind of knob that will be really weird, sometimes go very quickly, sometimes go very slow. And all these things are, there is a technical explanation, like, we've changed literally the electronic components, but it has to do with, choices of interface and how machines operate. So I think it's interface design, if I was to define it today, it's like the link between really interaction design, so trying to imagine how machines are going to be working and what do they do. There is this question we almost called our studio, how does it do what? Because it's actually from one of our clients who one day in a meeting I was trying to explain something and it was like, oh, this is a bit a how does it do what question. And I found it was brilliant, and then we really wanted to call our studio like this, but well, then it was a bit of a weird name. Anyway, but I think it's this question, like this kind of circular question where, when you imagine a product in 10 years, you have to understand what it's going to be doing and how it's going to be doing it. And it's kind of a circular thing, right? So interface design sits a bit between interaction, and I think it's part of the job of an interaction designer in some ways, but and industrial design, like, if you make a phone tomorrow, if you design a phone, you will be, designing the interface of the phone. Like, I mean, an iPhone is essentially an interface. Like the machine part of the iPhone, it's completely invisible. It's, it's inside the envelope. And the envelope of an iPhone, maybe 50% of it is the interface, because already the whole screen is, an interface plus a few buttons on the side. So yeah, I don't know if it answers your question, but that's how I would define interface design.
Yeah. And so when a client, without giving anything away, of course, we don't want to get you zapped.
No.
When a client approaches you, the product is already in train. It's already being probably imagined as a kind of object, as a kind of its size and its materials and so on and so forth. What is your role within that process? Where do you come in as interface designers? Where are you called in? Right at the beginning?
Okay, first, we don't necessarily come in as interface designers. And I think that's one of the things we were considering with the new studio is should we embrace this kind of thing because we have this book, and interface design is one part of what we do. But to your question, it could be earlier than that. So some clients, you will work with them on something that they don't really know what it is, right? So you really start from, that's where it really work with the strategy of a company. You try to understand with them where the market is going to be in 10 years based on, sociology, some trends, history, like could be all sort of inspiration that drives a rationale. And sometimes you might even propose competing theories, right? I could make a case for everybody wants more screens in 5 years, and I could also make a case for everybody hates screens in 5 years. And I think, sometimes being a designer, it's a bit like being a lawyer. It's like, trying to promote some kind of logical vision of something, but you can make a case for two things that are a bit competing. And you need to stay open-minded. I think, when you start to put too much of yourself into something, into what you really truly believe, you might be wrong. So you need to stay really open and accept that one vision that maybe is your preferred vision might be wrong. And sometimes your vision is your desire too, right? So yeah, so sometimes we come in earlier, so before there is anything decided, and sometimes indeed there is already something. And then as an interface designer, if we can, I mean, I don't think we are interface designers per se, but let's say that's part of our role. I think the main thing you're going to have to decide is what the thing they're working on is going to be doing. So that's where you really have this how does it do what question, right? You try to help them decide with the what is the core functionality, why people would be using what they want to do. And that then informs the how this is going to happen, right? But then sometimes the how gives you new opportunities of what. So that's why you have this kind of circular thing constantly. But I would say both cases exist. And sometimes you come in, they already have something, and you challenge it, and it's just a starting point. It's like a scientific hypothesis, right? They have something they're working on, but really what they want is to get challenged and to go to something different. So I would say every scenario is possible.
You mentioned theory, and you talked about the sort of the theorizing of, people want to use screens or they might not want to use screens in the future. Is there a broader kind of technical theory that sits by, or I suppose philosophical theory actually, that sits behind ideas of interaction design that you have founded your work on?
Yes, I mean, there are a few authors that I always come back to. Um, so, I mean, the book, as you've seen, has very few references because the subject matter is just like uh, very thin in terms of theoretical references, at least coming from the design world. And I think none of the references we have come from the design world. So there are, I would say, the most useful things. I like psychology, theories from psychology. Like, there is the thing about how we are constantly balancing ourselves between emissive states and receptive states. So that I often try to understand, especially when you look at creative tools. So, if you make musical instruments or, what's the difference between a camera, like a physical camera with buttons, etc., and an iPhone? Is there a difference? Like, so if you only consider the technology, they are pretty much the same object. I mean, with differences in quality of the optics and sensors, but, from a design perspective, if you start to consider the psychology of using a big camera that gives you like immediate feedback and forces you to make active decisions versus an iPhone or smartphone in general, where you can just press a button and everything is automated. It's completely different processes that you go through as a human. So when you start to look at that, it can really allow you to go much deeper in the way you think about the design. So these, I would say, I come back always to the same two or three authors. There is one specifically. I realized when we were writing the book, he's a co-author, so I always quote Victor Lowenfeld. But when we were writing the book and I had to find a quote from him, I realized it's him and another guy, I think Lambert Brittain. Very old book. I could find the name for you if you want. I don't have it here, but basically they wrote about art education for children in the US in the 50s. So, you cannot find an ebook version of that. You need to find but you can find a very cheap, like physical copy. So it's very dense. It's a lot about, children's psychology. I'm sure a lot of it is wrong by now because, it's 70 years ago. But it's very inspiring because they really go in the details of, what happens to the mind and the brain when you create. So one of the examples I always use because I find it fascinating, they even go to say that you should teach children to draw with a pen, charcoal, for instance, and not paint, especially watercolor, because watercolor you don't have the connection between the result of what you see and the motor control is not absolute because paint might start to move. And so they have all this description about how the act of creating something start with the motor control and the kinesthetic experience of like moving your pen on the page, and little by little you start to establish a connection between that and what you see, and then you start to look only at what you see, which arguably is a problem with adult where we are so like people who are usually not in the design world say, oh, I cannot draw. It's because people start to be obsessed with the result. They completely lost the enjoyment of the journey, right? So it's the journey versus destination thing. But now where the book is fascinating is that they show pictures of very young children who have the face, the head on the table. So they literally have very little interest in the result. They are really enjoying the, kinesthetic experience of moving the pen on the page. And little by little, as you grow up, your head moves back on the desk. So it's almost like this evolution kind of like graph of how we connect, the kinesthetic experience with, what we're creating and the intellectual part of the creation.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are very strong, kind of fundamental inspiration in how I like to think about, design and, creating new experiences and, how interactions work. And I think this book was also trying to really take time to think about these things quite seriously and be like, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean for, if you build a synthesizer or, a camera, what does it mean to have a focus on a lens that you can do with a rotation versus like a little knob on the side versus clicking buttons? And then you realize there is so many degrees of, possibilities that will create completely different experiences that might change the whole picture of the interaction between the human and the machine, and direct different results. And that's where, but you might have questions about that, so I don't want to spoil it now. But that's why at the end of the book we start to speak a lot about AI, because AI is raising a lot of questions there, because once you start to have automation, once we start to be very obsessed by results, you start to completely overlook all this aspect of the human experience of how we interact with machines. And I definitely think, and I think that's one of the big things we promote in the book, that this is a massive aspect. So if there is anything that needs to stand out from this book, is like reconsidering what the interface means for the interaction between humans and machine.
Really, really interesting. It sort of strikes me as being, in some way, so I've been thinking about haptics and play recently, and it's obviously become a bit of a thing. And the way that, for example, to go back to mobile phones, because they're probably the most common piece of technology we now interact with, there's been an emphasis on kind of making, as I understand it, and this is, just from my own interactions with them, there's clearly an effort to make the object itself responsive in a way that we would find normal or normative in relation to a tool. They're heavy, the buttons click, they judder when the battery's low, or you get a text message, or there's all sorts of things. And there's a tactile quality to them. A good quality phone feels like a good quality object. And obviously there's the aesthetics that they put into that as well. Again, Apple being the masters at that, probably, in terms of considering the cognitive interaction around the idea of a beautiful thing. And then there's things like luminescence that they play with as well, so to make it gaudy and pretty. But I was wondering, is there at the heart of this sort of design work a desire to engage people with something that is fundamentally abstract, fundamentally disengaging, in that you can do huge amounts of things on your phone or with technology and have no knowledge of what it's actually doing? Like, say, compared again to a hammer, you know what a hammer does. You swing it, it hits a thing, the nail goes in the wood, right? It's a very direct thing. You can understand that. As we've modernized, as we've complexified, our actual agency and our sense of agency is potentially vastly diminished. Compare a traditional spinning wheel versus a contemporary machine loom. They do the same thing, but one of them feels like a thing that's valuable. You feel like it's almost virtuous to use a traditional tool in a traditional way, to craft something, versus the machine, which is just like doing its thing, and you have no power to actually even understand what it's doing.
Yeah, or again, it's many questions in one.
Yeah,
and you even dropped craft at the end, which
I specialize in unbelievably run-on questions. It's part of my
No, it's
USP.
good. It's very good. I think just to clarify the beginning of your question, are you asking if there is a desire from these big companies to like remove maybe the interaction bit to
Well, to use interaction and interface design as a way of actually reconnecting, making people feel connected, and therefore have a sense of agency in their use of these very abstracting tools, like Google Maps, completely abstract.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things. There is the company business goal, right? And once you start to build, I mean, the smartphone, it's incredibly difficult to define what a smartphone is today.
Yeah,
It's even more than a personal computer. If you
yeah,
think about it, that's the true personal computer. I think before the smartphone, there was not no such thing, at least at the world scale, as a personal computer. But in the meantime, it's become even more, right?
yeah,
It's tickets to take the plane, it's way of payment. So defining, I think the smartphone as a category of product is very hard to define. So yeah, it does many things, and in a way, I think there is probably kind of divergent interest in people who make smartphones. So from a business perspective, you probably want to remove friction. And friction is a weird term because, you can see friction as, usually it's used in business as something that's negative, right? Friction is what prevents the user to engage in something that's going to make them do something more, and probably for you, selling them the service, for instance, getting more money. So friction is usually negative, but it's an interesting analogy with interfaces because in the book we really go in the details of like even physically how you design an interface. And if you add a bit of friction to a knob, for instance, in the design, you get a more satisfying experience of turning the knob because suddenly you can feel it's turning. So it's not even just satisfaction. By the way, I don't like too much satisfaction. It's used a lot in design. I always find it a bit superficial to say, oh, it's very satisfying.
yeah.
But
What word do
yeah,
you prefer?
no, I think it describes something. But I think it's a bit like when people say, oh, we do cool projects. It's like, okay, no, I don't know. It's like, I don't wake up to go to the studio to do cool stuff. I just don't like this kind of
Yeah,
language that's like trying to bring a layer of like interpretation to something that could be, I don't know. So satisfaction, I think it's often something that describes pleasure in a superficial way.
mhm,
Like, you could use a satisfactory experience for something that's purely evil, right? So,
yeah,
but anyway, I think it describes something, so I still use the word. So if you add friction to a knob or a wheel, you increase, it's more satisfying. But there is also a technical things that you do, which we detail in the book. It's like you make it more precise. Because if there is more friction, it's less likely to shake when I shake my hand, because maybe I just shake, right? Because it has a bit more physical resistance. So suddenly I can hold values. I can be more precise. I can have more control. So it's not just satisfying. There is an actual benefit, physical benefit. So yeah, adding friction in the interaction in general, I think there is something analog to that,
hmm
in the sense that it's also a moment where the user can understand they're doing something. And that's where it really depends what we're describing. So I used to always make the distinction between what I call conception tools and creation tools, right? So I think all the design principles of like making everything that simple, frictionless, apply quite well to conception. I don't want to feel myself doing the action of taking my phone to pay something, right? I just want it to work and to be quick because I might be in the tube, there are 15 people behind me, and I don't want to stop in front of the ticket machine to pay because there is a cool interaction that is very satisfying. No, I just want it to work instantly. So face recognition is pretty good. But if I'm making music or if I'm taking a picture, the frictionless experience of my iPhone, which allows me to take a picture by just pressing something without even thinking about it, suddenly doesn't really resonate with me. And here I use me as personal because I think this is very subjective. But I would say most photographers would feel the same. It's like I quite enjoy a big camera that's heavier, that doesn't allow me to take so many pictures, which is a value for me. I think I don't want to come back from holiday with 2,000 pictures if I can have only 200. So something that takes a bit more time, forces me to, make a more conscious decision is quite positive. And I think the extreme of that, and that's what we describe at the end of the book, that's why when you were asking about like, is there maybe a drive to remove completely the friction and the interface to disappear? I think there is absolutely. And if you look, there are some interviews of Elon Musk about what's the company Neuralink, which is, the ultimate interface. So there is the thing that's described a bit in the tech world as the ultimate interface. Like, this idea that everything culminates into something that's better than everything before and renders everything else obsolete. So when you hear people speaking about brain interface or body interface in general, there is this idea, and that's definitely in this interview of Musk, I'm pretty sure he says something like, if you remove all the barriers of traditional interfaces, so i.e. non-brain implant, then you allow for the true expression of the human self. I might be wrong in the quote, but it's something along these lines. It's like basically the interface is a limitation of the true potential of the human. And I don't remember the examples that he gives, but it might be something about expressing oneself. So saying, even speaking for him is an interface. And right now, for instance, because maybe I have a French accent and maybe my mother tongue is different, I'm not expressing myself as well as if I were thinking, which is an interesting idea. But I think it's also like, I think there is value in like the friction of speaking.
Yeah.
And like looking for your words. And anyone who's been trying to use AI to like, come up with like a summary of their thought, and I've certainly done that, you end up dealing with a lot of data and a lot of things, which maybe just typing something on your phone or on your computer would solve by just, adding friction. So yeah, so I think there is definitely one side of these big companies, and not so big. I mean, there are startups who also look into, let's remove all the friction and find the ultimate interface. And I think there is a lot of belief that AI is kind of powering that. And I think there is another direction. You mentioned Google Maps, where you have people who really look in the details of, I mean, I say Google Maps not as Google, but someone who would be working in the team of maps at Google would probably be really focused on what is the experience of like zooming on a map and how do I make that enjoyable and purposeful. Which is not necessarily because they have a grander vision of design or the purpose of design, but just because their job is to make this micro experience, I mean, I say micro experience, this experience like enjoyable for the user. And then I think there is a third one, which is more the metaphysical kind of angle on that, which is probably the one we took with the book, where we really try to understand what it means. So, what does it mean to create a song by speaking to an interface? How is it the same as playing on the piano? Like, and actually, I mean, the music one is maybe not so many people would relate to that, but generating images. I was speaking with a friend of mine this weekend who works for a big car company, and he was telling me that they now use a lot of image generation in the for the design process, which I was quite surprised by. Especially, I mean, I'm not surprised that people would do that in companies. I was surprised that he seemed to enjoy it. I was like, so you prefer that? And he was like, yeah, I mean, it's more like art direction than design. But if you have ideas and opinions, you can very quickly get much more than, by sketching, modeling, rendering. Whereas in my opinion, and I might be wrong, but I think we are losing something massive there, So, and that's the real debate today. And I know you have been thinking about that and discussing that with other people as well. But I think it's a big question, and it comes back really to journey, destination thing. It's like
Mm.
destination is important. Yes, sometimes we want to do something specific, but let's not systematically overlook the journey. I think
Yeah.
a big part of what we do is about the journey.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. You've mentioned AI and you mentioned VR at the beginning, and AR is obviously something that's coming along very fast as well. What are I mean, without again giving away any trade secrets, what are the projected, um, what is the projected space for interaction and interface design in relation to these things like AI, where, they talk about, for example, artificial intelligence removing certain kinds of jobs, it's certainly going to do that. Probably even lecturers, to be honest. Um,
Mm.
Probably university education is in a parlor situation because of this very thing. But I wonder whether, yeah, whether you've got any thoughts about how these new technologies are starting to inflect your own practice.
Yeah, okay, so they're all quite different. If we just, I think we can do quite quickly the AR VR part.
Mm,
Um, that might be, the way that might be a kind of like one-to-one replacement to phones in the next 5 years. Why not? I mean, the technology is not very far. I think there is a big question, which I find kind of interesting, is I don't know if people are going to perceive glasses as a solution to, the current problem of, you enter the tube and everybody is the head in their phone, which is quite scary.
yeah.
So something more immersive, like glasses on your nose, is it going to be something better, like a solution? Because, it's maybe a bit more in and out, like, you need something, it appears and it disappears. Or is it just like, you know, the end of everything? Like suddenly people are, not only they are constantly absorbed by something, but on top of that, they don't even signal it to the external world because they have glasses and you have no way to tell if they're looking at you or watching football.
Hmm.
So I don't know if it's going to be one or the other. I don't know if it's going to be perceived as one or the other. And as such, I don't know if it's going to be adopted massively or rejected. And that's even before we consider the technological angle. But I think as designers, that's what I love. Is like while everybody else is like debating about technology, you can just assume technology is going to work at some point. So you can start to think, okay, let's assume it works. Now, what does it mean? And I think that's really what I love. And that's where, using this older psychology book
Mm,
and, philosophy, etc., you can sometimes find answers or at least like
mm,
ideas about how to think about things. Um, there is one aspect that we discuss in the book. I think it's a bit technical, but it might change the way the whole computer system now is like, I mean, I don't know if it's called the app paradigm, but I call it the app paradigm. Everything is an app, an application.
mm,
And that might disappear.
mhm,
Um, because if you think about it, it's a bit weird. If, all the digital world is integrated in your physical world, why would you have to launch an app every time you do something? It's a bit like you go in the kitchen, you need to cook, and you need to, on top of being in your kitchen and cooking, starting an application that has to do with, recipes and stuff like this. So that's not the best example, but we dive a bit more into that in the book. And there are, for other reasons, people who believe that apps are going to disappear. And one of them is AI. It's like, or you could have AI generating on the fly whatever you need to be doing, right?
mhm,
So I think that's a very short version of what we can say about AR and VR. I definitely think glasses are going to be something at some point. But again, it really, how it's going to impact our life really depends on how we perceive them in
mm,
contrast to what we use today. AI is a much more complex question. I mean, there is voice as well, which is kind of like linked to AI. Um, so I think voice, what's interesting is it feels very new, but in a way it's how computing started. Because, we started with language. Like the earlier computers were like, you would type command lines and then it would do something. So it was a very narrow typology of users. Whereas today, because it's more intelligent, you can have anybody speaking to AI. But the thing is, it relies on, language, logical thinking. So I think seeing it as the ultimate interface, like you just speak to computers and to machines in general, I think is overlooking everything we were speaking about earlier about, like abstract processes. Like, when I play the piano, I'm not like thinking about every single action I do with my fingers.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of intuition and like, something bodily kinesthetic connection. Um, but okay, now if we speak about AI really as a technology that goes everywhere, I think there are a lot of questions. So just for the anecdote, when we were writing the book, the last chapter, which is a bit like future prediction, we had, when we were speaking about it amongst ourselves, we were like, oh, the AI chapter. But then at some point it was like, oh, which AI chapter? And in a way, the three chapters at the end have AI inside them because, it's a topic that's just changing everything. So whatever you look at in the future, you cannot really abstract yourself from like, remove yourself from, considering this. Yeah, I think there is a potential for I think if I focus on the biggest danger that I see with AI, it's removing agency. I think if you really fast forward and say it's going to work, it's going to be implemented, we're going to have like, neural interfaces, then you can see that the distinction between active decision of interacting with machine and passive decisions, which by the way already exist today. So, if you have automation, you're already having passive interactions, right? It's like the machine predicts that you want the light to switch on. But there are still simple rules. They are like, we call it automation. It's basic. Once you have like your intention that are measured constantly to kind of like provide you with whatever interaction you were maybe planning to do in the next few seconds, once you start to, have maybe thoughts that are subcontracted to AI and fed back to you. So, you look at someone and instantly you have an intuition of who the person is and you have some knowledge about them. Like, I mean, it's very futuristic, but it's not that impossible if you consider, we have all the technological bricks already.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's like, how are you ever going to know who you are and what you think and what you want to do? Everything is going to be kind of prediction of kind of live prediction of what you're about to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that's the biggest thing that I see with AI being a big danger for humanity. You were asking for design. I think that's yeah, it's a bit more short term and and I think it's more like, I mean, it goes back to a question of interface. I think you could have AI tools that help you do more things, and it's all a question of interface. And that's why, at the beginning you were asking if the book was like, was it even a discipline? Is it even a topic? And definitely when we started the book, we thought it was very niche. But the more we were writing, the more we realized it kind of connected to so many topics.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the big question for now of AI, I'm not speaking of prediction, this is like the next question, but the one of today, which is going to decide if, there are jobs or if there is even pleasure to be found in being a designer. I think it's an interface question.
Yeah.
If we think that the ultimate way of using AI is expressing a desire, which is exactly what we have today, right? You write a prompt. If we think that's the best way to create, that's yeah, I think design might disappear. And creative jobs in general, because everybody has desires, It's but I think you can also build interfaces that bring back, the intuitiveness, tactility, and all the things that allow to construct something,
Yeah.
not just get an instant result.
Yeah, yeah.
For me, it's eminently a design question.
Yeah.
I mean, interface design question.
Yeah. I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about if you use ChatGPT and you type in a question like, make me an image of, I did one the other day, I was making a little cover picture for podcast and I'm psychoanalysis and architecture, and it generated an image. And I said, make it portrait, not landscape. And it just came up with a completely different image. And I liked the one before. I mean, I wasn't like nuancing it or anything like that. It was very, very offhand. And that immediacy, that speed, was very frustrating. The interface, my interface with it, what I wanted it to do was a designerly process, which was adapt what it had done according to these new parameters that I'd set, which were very simple parameters, go from horizontal to vertical. But my interaction with it was one of frustration, actually, which is quite interesting as an idea. My wife was doing it. She was getting a summary. She was having a summary written of Dr. Faustus and deriving some questions off the back of it. And she lost that. She shut the window or something like that. And then she opened it back up and it came up with ones that she didn't think were as good, which is an interesting values question as well. And yeah, that feeling of disengagement that you therefore feel, and that feeling of disempowerment that you therefore feel, is where traditional analog processes of design are advantageous in that they're slow. There's that beautiful slowness about them, which Elon Musk doesn't seem to be particularly interested in. I was wondering, just to finish though, to think about where interaction and interface design might play a role in our wider perception of the built environment. As architects,
Yeah.
obviously we do think about buildings as platforms for interaction, interfacing. But I don't suppose, particularly in more high-end and more technologically complex ecotechnic kind of approaches, there is much thought about that. And when you walk through the City of London, you certainly get that feeling that there's not been much thought about the interface of the building, the person, the user, the wider public, and even perhaps even history. Have you spent any time thinking about this? Is this an area that interface design has of potential value or a view?
Yeah, I mean, again, I tend to look at architecture as, just another field of design, and I think there are long debates. I mean, a very respectable field of design with a much longer history than any other design discipline, but I like to look at the similarities between things rather than the differences. And so in a way, what has happened in the world of like manufactured objects, to look at industrial design and product design, where I would say today a good half of them are like machines. And it's not a very sexy term, but we say devices, we say all sorts of terms, but basically we're saying everything is a machine. And when we were writing the book, I was trying to list all the things that are not machines, and it's not many things, like furniture. And even, like you look at IKEA, where IKEA is going, you have a lot of like furniture that's becoming kind of like connected or intelligent. So even furniture is turning into machines in some ways. So I think the same phenomenon is probably going to happen in the built environment. In a way, I had this discussion actually once with someone working in a big architecture firm in London, and I was trying to explain what we do, and her conclusion was like, "Oh wow, so I guess I'm an interaction designer." And I think it was a more philosophical take on what I had just said. I think she was not suggesting that she was exactly looking at the complexity of the technology that we have to deal with in what we call interaction design today. But definitely, I think at a philosophical level, what she was expressing is there was a transition in her architecture practice into how they were thinking about the experience of the user, right? And hence, starting to realize that maybe what they were going toward was something a bit more integrated, and something that could look like interaction design. So I think, okay, you have today, it's a bit obvious and maybe a bit of a boring topic, but definitely not solved. Like you look at all the home automation, and I was trying to buy some smart bulbs 2 months ago. Just wanted to have a light to wake up in the morning because I'm terrible at waking up, right? So I'm like, oh, surely I can get a bulb that's going to do that. But then you look at, okay, I need a hub, and then this hub needs to connect to Wi-Fi, and then I need more bulbs, and then you start to look at all this crazy stuff and this website that compare them, and like the complexity of the thing, and maybe You already have 5G, Wi-Fi, you're adding like some more like interferences and stuff, maybe with your brain, maybe with your existing system. I'm not even speaking about privacy. Like, could one of these systems be recording you? So anyway, I didn't buy anything, right? And I just felt probably this whole space is still in, we like to call it like the inventor's age. It's something we kind of used, a new theory that might go in the new book. But like it seems that every artifact goes through an inventor's age before being in the designer's age, where rules are not established, and everything can be a bit like decided by whoever is operating in that field. So I think it would make much more sense that these kind of things are decided, at an earlier stage. Again, it's a very technical consideration of what interaction design could mean in the construction and built environment and architecture, but I definitely see that at some point becoming something that's more on the hands of designers effectively than the users and people who live in the space. But then I think it already happens as well. If you really look, there are a few considerations that we had when we were writing the book. But if you go in clubs today, like the whole architecture of a club, and I mean club like music clubs with DJs and everything. The whole architecture of a club today is reorganized, you could say, around machines. But again, I don't think it's the machine, because synthesizer today could be big as a USB stick. So the whole design of a club today is organized around the interface. Like, people are fascinated by people, DJs and music producers moving knobs and pressing buttons on like some interface full of lights. I don't know, 30 years ago, probably people were looking at each other dancing, or maybe like some kind of band. And now the whole choreography of party is designed around an interface, which is quite fascinating. And even, if you look, I think like this connection between interface and more generally machines with the built environment is quite old, like Le Corbusier in the 20s, the whole, how does it call it, the machine for living in? Like, it's all the inspiration of like how industrialization and the efficiency of machine is going to like affect the way we build things, which, in some ways became real for some aspect, and other ways was like probably a bit too far-fetched. And another thing we were looking at this summer is, in the history of machines in the 19th century, it occurred to me that, Louis Sullivan, when he writes like, form ever follows function, that is the rule, or which we shorten by form follows function. I'm pretty sure it's something that is, because he's a very curious mind, right? He's looking at everything that happens around him at the time. And this is very much the time where you have the first aeroplanes, the car, bicycles, and all these machines, it's very early stage for them, right? So they are not designed by anything but science. Like, at a plane at the time and a bicycle. I think the car and the bicycle have evolved a bit, but the plane, even to this day, is very much designed, the design is directed by like, physics. And I think that must have influenced the way he thought about, design in general. Because you look at these machines that suddenly are a big focus of the society and the culture, and you're a designer, and you're quite a prominent designer, and you must think like, how does it work? Like, who's deciding on these things? So I think there is always a connection between all the fields, and probably there will be more of the thinking about interactions in the built environment in the next few years.
Grand. Good point to finish on. Thank you ever so much, Guillaume. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
This is the hour of lead, remembered, if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. I was thinking about Emily Dickinson, and I was thinking about the sensory, so this poem seemed apt. but maybe it's got nothing to do with anything. Thanks to Guillaume for taking the time to speak with me and for sending me a copy of the book. It's really good. If this is your bag, definitely get a copy. There's a link in the podcast description, as well as links to Guillaume's social and professional profiles. And thanks for listening.